name is Alan Philps. I am editor of The World Today. We have with us Helen Fitzwilliam to my right, who wrote, produced, and directed the short film we're about to see. Helen started as a news reporter with the BBC, and since then has moved on to making critically acclaimed documentaries for National Geographic, PBS, and Channel 4. These documentaries include the Emmy Award-winning Illicit, about the dark side of globalization, and more recently, Secrets of the Vatican. On my left is Professor Paul Bailey, Professor of Modern Chinese History at the University of Durham. He is the academic expert in the UK on this topic. His forthcoming book out in November, I think the title says it's all, is Chinese Overseas Label in World War I France, Migrant Workers, Globalization, and the Sino-French Connection. So Paul will be able to put the events in the context of the time, their effect on Chinese politics, and we can also look at Sino-French relations to this day. So to begin with, Helen will briefly introduce the film, and then we'll show it, and then Paul will speak, and we can have some questions and answers. Helen.
I was living in Washington, and one of our neighbors turned out to be a translator for Nixon during the Nixon-Mao talks. So I was riveted by this, and I'm still trying to make a documentary on that topic. But while we were talking, he said, well, what about the story of the Chinese in the First World War? And I said, what story of the Chinese in the First World War? I've never even heard of them. How on earth did they become involved? So I started trying to find out more about it and became more and more intrigued that this story didn't seem to be known over here or in China. And so then I pitched the story, and Alan, very kindly, at Chatham House and The World Today, decided to commission it because he too thought it was a forgotten story that should be told. It was interesting trying. We didn't have enough money, sadly, to go all the way to China, which I would have loved to do. But obviously, I spoke. The film is supposed to complement the magazine article, which has far more facts and information. Film tends to be far more emotional. And what I wanted to find out was really the Chinese angle, and to find out why there were no memorials to the Chinese workers, 140,000 of them who'd come all the way from China, many of whom, at least 2,000 we know of, had lost their lives in Flanders and France, and quite a few hundred died in submarine attacks actually coming from China to northern France. And so once you go to Flanders and visit all of the cemeteries, all these extra stories come out. And so I just wanted to explore that story, and I hope you like the film. Ypres is a city of memorials. Everywhere there are reminders of the young men who were slaughtered in the battles of the First Global War.
At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them.
While the soldiers who gave their lives are remembered, a chapter of this story has been forgotten for decades. The role of 140,000 workers recruited by the British and French in China in order to free up more European men for the battlefront. It was here in the mud and carnage of Flanders that most of the Chinese labourers came to work behind the front lines, digging trenches and toiling in the docks and arms factories for the Allies. But they were also digging the foundations for the 21st century's rising superpower. It was a gamble by the Chinese government to send thousands of its citizens to Europe, but they hoped it would win them more status in the West and the rights to Germany's colonial possessions in China. The main motivation for the workers was money.
My father, like most Chinese, wanted to leave China in order to have a better life, because in China at that time, poverty was everywhere. Most of the Chinese who came were illiterate, so if they could not sign the work contract, they used a thumbprint instead.
now all of a sudden you have tens of thousands of Chinese really coming to the heart of whiteness, as to paraphrase Joseph Conrad. And by consequence, I mean, it also brought a major culture shock to both parties.
The 100,000 Chinese working for the British Army were confined in camps under armed guard behind the front line. Although they were out of range of enemy fire, death found them anyway. This is the site of the old Chinese camp at Poperinghe. German airplanes were flying low overhead, and one of the Chinese workers came out of the hut to take a look at them and lit a cigarette in the blackout. The ensuing bomb killed at least 10 men and wounded 30. The remaining Chinese fled in panic, and some of them didn't stop running for at least 2 hours.
They had no idea about the war or the situation in France and Europe. It had a great impact on them. They were completely traumatized by the war and its violence.
And they had more than the enemy to worry about. The workers had unknowingly committed themselves to 3 years military discipline under their British officers. Punishments included being tied to a post or barbed wire, fines for insubordination, and prison sentences for strikers.
They would be described as children who need a good flogging in order to do their proper work. The British having that empire, and the empire in fact being ruled by a very tiny group of Europeans, could only exist through the myth of white superiority. And so that white superiority, which also became very embedded in the British mind, was also shown towards the Chinese labourers.
We know the local people felt sympathetic towards the victims of harsh British treatment due to a Belgian priest who kept a diary throughout the war. Father Van Wellingen preached at this church here in Dikkebus. He relates how residents joined in the Chinese New Year celebrations in 1918, and shopkeepers learned a few words of Mandarin to welcome their new customers. In the diary, Father Wellingen records that far from being the docile slaves the Allies expected, the workers became mutinous when disputes about their conditions of employment broke out.
At some of the camps, the Chinese are starting to get quite rebellious. Yesterday, they stabbed an English officer. Today, 30 of them at Busseboom refuse to work. They just lay on the ground, waiting to be hit.
Along with the illiterate labourers came a few hundred Chinese students to act as interpreters. The two classes would never normally meet, but were thrown together by the war. Working side by side in the factories of France sowed the seeds of a social conscience in China's elite, with lasting consequences.
France acted as a bridge between the Chinese intellectuals and the Chinese workers. The Chinese workers became more politically aware, and the Chinese intellectuals finally understood the misery and poverty of their people.
One of the translators, Gu Xin-chin, wrote his memoirs in 1937. His book describes how the intellectuals came to understand the importance of the labourers' contribution. For many, it was a kind of political awakening.
You can't win a war without relying on the workers. It is important to make it clear what we should call working soldiers are the main artery of the army.
They may have ended up on the winning side, but in the lawless times after the armistice, conditions were even tougher for the Chinese. Many were killed by unexploded shells when collecting bodies from no man's land, or died in the Spanish flu epidemic that engulfed Europe, and the locals turned against them.
The Chinese became scapegoats for everything that went wrong.
And further betrayal awaited them in Paris. Expectations were running high as the Chinese had won their place at the peace conference, but they came away with nothing. The 1919 Treaty of Versailles handed over Germany's colonial possessions in China to Japan. The Chinese diplomats were staying at the Lutetia Hotel. When the news broke, Chinese students in Paris surrounded the building to prevent them from leaving. It's hard to know how many workers took part in the protests, but in Gu's memoirs, he writes that one of the labourers sent a pistol to the head of the Chinese delegation with the message that he should use it on himself if he dared to sign the treaty, or he would come and kill him. China's humiliation at Versailles triggered student protests back in Beijing, which became known as the May 4th movement. Feeling betrayed by the West, the protesters looked for new sources of inspiration. In time, this led to the triumph of the Communist Party.
The Chinese workers' participation steered China towards a sort of revolution, a revolution for the people.
By 1920, the British had sent home all of their workers, but the French allowed 3,000 to stay on after the war. Unlike the British, the French had allowed the Chinese to mix with the local population, and in some cases, romance blossomed. Gérard's father was determined to stay.
I don't know. I think it was love.
Gérard's parents went on to have 13 children.
These are my memories. They're all I have left. They're part of me. If Colonel Trouptiel hadn't gone to recruit the Chinese in 1917, I wouldn't be sitting here with you today.
There are 10 military cemeteries in France and Flanders where Chinese labourers are buried. Visitors are often surprised to see Chinese characters on the gravestones. But as the centenary of the First World War approaches, their role in the making of modern China is finally being recognised and reassessed.
The official communist view of the Communist Party has always been that the First World War was an imperialist war and that China had nothing to do with it. On the other hand, more and more there is this view of, well, we are an emerging world power, so let's see how China behaved on the world stage in the past.
There have been a lot of memorials to the soldiers who died, but it's also worth remembering the contribution of a small group of men who travelled halfway across the world and began something whose significance is only just becoming clear 100 years later. I would very quickly thank my team, because I've never done it without my wonderful cameraman William, without Nakani, who edited it, and without Faye, who is my researcher. So they're just as, they really deserve the credit as well.
Very well deserved. Paul, would you like to speak on the significance of the Chinese workers?
Like Helen, when I first started researching Chinese workers worldwide back in the early 80s, there was no one, either in China or in Europe, that knew anything about this story or was interested in it. And as Dominic Denneven says in the film, in China itself, in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, during Mao's day, the First World War, was, in a classical Leninist view, it was a clash between greedy and avaricious imperialisms. And the Chinese workers themselves were simply seen as passive victims. It sort of helped to sort of substantiate their story of an exploited China in the 19th and 20th century. So in the discourse, in the descriptions of these Chinese workers, they were simply described as cannon fodder, horribly exploited, cruelly treated victims of nasty, greedy imperialist powers. And as late as 2000, well after Mao's death, when I started to do some serious research on this subject, I went to the two ports from where the Chinese workers embarked for Europe. One is Weihai. Both these ports are in Shandong province, which is where most of the Chinese workers came from. There's in total about 137,000 workers, 37,000 recruited by France, and about 96,000 recruited by Britain. And most of them embarked from Weihai in the north of Shandong province, northern China, and Qingdao, which is the former German leasehold territory, which Japan had occupied in the first weeks of the war as Britain's ally. So I thought, well, these two places would be a fantastic place to do research in 2000. I went to Weihai Wei, I went to the archives office, the Archives Bureau, and I met all the people there. They were all very friendly and helpful, and I said, you know, I'm doing research on the Chinese workers, and I got rather blank looks. And the director said, well, let me show you an exhibition we're organizing on the history of Weihai Wei. I thought, fantastic, I'll find some photographs, I'll find some artifacts, I'll find some information about the Chinese workers. So he took me to this exhibition organized by the Archives Bureau, took up a full room, and looked at all these photos of Weihai Wei, nice pictures of Weihai Wei, local history. There was not a single reference to Chinese workers, you know, who had embarked, thousands of them from Weihai Wei in 1917, 1918. So I asked the curator of the exhibition, you know, I said, well, don't you have any information on the Chinese workers in World War I? He looked rather sheepish. So he said, come here. And he took me to a little cupboard at the back of the hall. I opened this cupboard, which obviously hadn't seen daylight. There was cobwebs everywhere, dust everywhere. And he took out two photographs, you know, photographs which had been put on a background there of Chinese workers. That was the only thing in the Archives Bureau, you know, and it wasn't on show. And then I went down to Qingdao, a little bit disappointed, not too hopeful, and I visited the local history museum at Qingdao. And again, there was virtually nothing on the Chinese workers. There's one photograph of the Chinese workers embarking for Europe, and the caption simply said, these are the sort of poor, sad, exploited victims, you know, tricked and deceived by those nefarious Western imperialist powers to serve as cannon fodder. That was the description that kept coming up. They're cannon fodder for the greedy imperialist powers. So this was late in 2000. But I mean, since then, there's been a dramatic change. Because I was talking to Helen earlier on, the Chinese television, English language international television channel, CCTV, broadcast a 6-part documentary in 2010 on the Chinese workers in World War I. And the line there is very, very different from what I had experienced in 2000. Because in this documentary, the Chinese workers are now perceived as heroes, are now perceived as active contributors to world peace and harmony. And as the opening episode says, all these Chinese workers, and I quote, if I can remember correctly, standing shoulder to shoulder with their British and French counterparts in resisting military aggression, militarism, in the cause of world peace. And it's no accident, I think, that we've seen this change, because it fits in very nicely with the current Chinese agenda, Chinese government agenda, of demonstrating China's positive global interactions, not only now to calm or placate fears, you know, of a rise in China. The idea is that China's rise is a peaceful one, and it's able to build on a legacy, a history, a tradition of China's positive interaction with the world. So the World War I Chinese workers now have been transformed from the exploited, passive coolies, you know, a very derogatory term, to what I would call transnational agents, you know, active contributors to world peace. So in a sense, they've been appropriated. On the French side, again, it's very interesting that for a long time, the story of Chinese workers in France was completely ignored. And I think there's a larger reason for that, that until fairly recently, until what, the last 10 or 15 years, most studies of World War I have been very Eurocentric, have been very Western-centric. It's been seen as a European war, and the focus has been on the European participants. But it's only now, I mean, relatively recently, that we're becoming more and more aware of the huge contribution and participation of the extra-European world, the non-European world, literally the thousands and thousands of colonial labor from Britain's colonies, South Africa, the Caribbean, India, from France's colonies, Vietnam. There were over 50,000 Vietnamese workers and soldiers, actually, conscripted by France. Its colonies in North Africa, Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, French West Africa. So within that context, you know, that there are now works, now studies of World War I that have enlarged the context, enlarged the vision, and that we're beginning to see, you know, that the participation and how World War I impacted on non-European peoples and their contribution and participation in war. But I think there's also a more prosaic reason, I think, why there's been increasing interest. I was talking to Alan about this earlier. I mean, that is, in a sense, to boost tourism, to put it bluntly. Because it's not only Chinese workers that is now being publicized, the presence of Chinese workers in World War I, and it's the presence of Chinese students at the same time, more or less the same time. In Helen's film, it was mentioned that the Chinese workers employed by France, they had 5-year contracts. The Chinese workers under British employ had 3-year contracts. So those Chinese workers recruited by Britain had all been repatriated by 1919, 1920, all of them. But over 3,000, as Helen's film showed, stayed on in France after the expiry of their contracts in 1922. Some intermarried with French women, and as we saw, Gerald Chang and others, you know, are the descendants living in France. But you know, with Chinese students, Chinese work-study students also began to arrive in France in 1919. So their presence coincides with the presence of Chinese workers. Many of these students were called work-study students. The aim was that they'd come to France, they'd get jobs in French factories to finance their studies in France. It was organized by Chinese intellectuals who were very pro-French, very Francophile, and who believed that, you know, France was the civilized, you know, the principal civilized country in the world, and that Chinese students could learn a lot. Many of these Chinese students, these work-study students, became future leaders of the Chinese Communist Party, including Zhou Enlai, Deng Xiaoping, and many others. In other words, their experience in France was one where they first became converted to Marxism. People like Zhou Enlai set up branch associations of the Chinese Communist Party, you know, which was founded in China in 1921. I think the French government is buttoned onto the fact, you know, this is a very useful tourist thing. So, I mean, they promote the towns, for example, where Chinese students live, Montargis, which is just south of Paris, where many of these work-study students were based. You know, if you read the webpage, you can Google Montargis and the local mayor welcoming tourists, and there's more and more Chinese tourists coming to, you know, because this is a story they know nothing about. And then finally, I'll just finish soon, Alan. The other interesting reason why there's been increased interest in France is that, again, just as in the case of China, as I was mentioning, it fits in China, it fits in with this wider agenda of promoting China's globalization and positive interaction with the world. So in France, again, in the last 10 or 15 years, there's been, especially, you know, I mean, there's been a sort of agenda amongst some intellectuals, amongst some government ministers, to promote or to emphasize or to highlight the history of immigration in France's history and the contribution of immigrants to France's national history. And this culminated in the opening of a museum in Paris in 2007, the Museum of the History of Immigration, which was meant to be a place that glorifies and valorizes immigrants and immigration as an integral part of French history. As you can imagine, this has been quite a controversial subject, you know, as usual in France, you know, and it sparked debates between the right and the left, you know, the right who act.
I'll finish that.
Okay, the right to insist, well, no, France, you know, sort of still anchored to this idea of homogenous French identity, you know, la vraie France, la France profonde. And those terrible leftists who are talking about multiculturalism and, and immigration and, and sort of a mix of cultures. So that it's become embroiled in a sort of political battle. But in this museum, there is a little section on the Chinese workers, not very much, very scanty actually. It just has a couple of photographs and a copy of the contract, but it's a start, this is why I think this has captured the interest in China and France. It's linked to these wider political agendas.
Thank you very much, Paul.